Check those clocks, those watches, smart or dumb.
It's time
It is a
to
time
party.
to think.
Oh, time
it's
to
time
think.
for a birthday party.
Aw.
Happy birthday.
Thank you, Josh.
Happy birthday, dear friend.
Thank you.
That's Mr. Rogers. It's the best, most awkward birthday YouTube video you could send. It says, happy birthday, dear friends. And then at the end, he says, and if it's not your birthday, happy unbirthday to you.
Wow.
Which is just weird. Like,
Isn't Happy on Birthday Winnie the Pooh? Like, isn't
Is
that? Yeah, I think they sang Happy on Birthday.
it's just like,
I think Tigger sang it. Anyways, whatever.
why do you need to reference someone it's not their birthday
Yeah.
on someone else's birthday?
I mean, we're happy you're born.
Like, it's not, happy birthday, Chris, and Josh is important too.
It's actually kind of like a socialist birthday wish. It's like everybody's birthday matters, no matter what, any day. Who cares? Well, we
only-
care about individuals here.
Only your birthday matters, Chris.
Yes, well, thank you.
Birthday. I won't say whatever the number is. You look 33. I'll
Thanks,
say that.
Josh. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Running joke is that Chris is older, but Josh looks older because of, male pattern.
We actually did have that conversation, yesterday.
Yeah.
Actually, we had some folks over at our house last night for my birthday, and they were saying, I just thought Josh was older. And, it's the very nicely shaved bald head. It's you did it well. You did it very well.
Well, that's a pleasant change from when will Josh grow up to I thought Josh was
Yeah,
older.
but and it's how you
know?
carry yourself. You're very professional. You're very type A. You stay on top of things, and I don't necessarily do that stuff. So
You think that's what it is? See, I'm always. This
That's
is
a big
why
part of
you. This is why you need brothers in Christ, sisters in Christ, a church family. Because I still, every time you say that, I think I don't think I'm type A. I feel like I'm constantly embarrassing my wife by saying silly things. Like I don't feel put together. And,
No.
And my inner monologue when I'm preaching or when I'm leading is, oh my gosh, I hope I don't say the wrong thing. Terrified half the time.
yeah. Well, you're relative type A
I don't
at least.
see myself as in control, But then you guys,
Yeah.
one of the dear sisters in the church said, "You're a control freak" one time, and I was like, "Change your opinion."
Change your opinion.
But that's why you need a. I don't know if I've shared this story before, but my wife and I were reading Ted Tripp's parenting book, something Shepherding a Child's Heart, and there's a chapter that talks about parenting idolatries, and it's like the idolatry of academic achievement above all else, or athletic prowess, or
Sure.
sociability, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And one of them, it was kind of like, as a parent, which one are you going to tend towards? And I read through them, and I was like, I don't know. I don't see any of these. Not because I'm perfect.
Because you're great. Yeah.
But the assignment was to ask your spouse, and my wife was like, "Oh, you control for sure." I was like, "What do you mean?" She goes, "You get mad at the dog when she doesn't obey you the first time." And I was like, "Oh, I needed someone to point that out."
Womp womp. Oh.
So what's funny about it is, okay, I've got my wife saying it, I've got a sister in the church saying it, I've got Chris saying it, and I'm still like, I don't see it. But I have to say, maybe they're right.
We also had some interesting, so to kind of make you feel better in some ways and
Thank
make some
you.
other people feel worse. One of our dear brothers, whom I shall not name, but if he's listening, he knows exactly who he is, and I love
Shall he
him.
not be named?
Yeah, well, yeah, he'll know. But I love the guy, and he's really truly one of my best friends, and he and his wife lead a summer camp in the
Just
summertime.
got narrowed down.
Yeah, it did. And
Just got
they were
narrowed
doing a
down.
check-in, and he and his wife were sitting there, and long story short, effectively, one of the parents who are dropping their kids off mistook his wife for his daughter.
Oh.
And
I can see it.
So he gets some older comments sometimes, and he's an awesome guy. I love the guy, and he's your age. He's
Yeah.
actually a few months younger than you. So got that, and then the other day I went and signed up.
Where the young people look old and the
The old people look young, yeah.
and-
Or we all just look the same. I mean, couldn't
Yeah.
that be? Everybody like tops out at the same age. It's like heaven, right?
That's right, yeah.
And then the other day, I went and got a Costco membership over in Appleton, and went with Lydia, my daughter, 15 years old, and the girl at the checkout counter thought she was my wife. So she bumped up her age and bumped down my age, and I just looked at her. I'm like, "This is my little girl." That's what I said, and so that was that.
It was always
So,
funny with your sister or daughter. And
Sure.
you're like, stop that thought. This is my sister.
yeah,
Like,
exactly,
We're done here.
exactly.
Yeah. Well, welcome to A Time to Think. We have schedules just haven't lined up with travel and sickness, but hopefully now that the sun is shining a little bit brighter and hotter, and illnesses probably are a little bit fewer and farther in between. We'll be more consistent here on Time to Think. We've been slowly poking through a book called Digital Liturgies. This book, at least in Wausau, I referenced it in talking about Revelation 18 because Revelation, was it 18? 17, I think, actually. 17 is the beginning of the picture of the harlot Babylon. Right?
Yeah.
And she's described in seductive language, in alluring language, in beautiful language, and she's called a harlot, right? What do harlots do? They attract someone to their demise. And one of the things I pointed out in trying to figure out what does this book have to say to us, maybe when our church doesn't feel like they're at threat of worshiping at a pagan feast in order to be able to work in the marketplace, like in the first century. Maybe we don't see visual statues of idols to be bowed down to in the public square.
Yeah.
But what is attractive, what's alluring? And the point I made in Revelation 17 was that the primary thing Satan is doing with the spirit of Babylon is tempting the people of God to be unfaithful. So that's the whole temptation.
Yeah.
Look at this alluring woman. Look at this powerful beast. Be faithful to them and trust them rather than to God.
Yeah.
And I made the point that, and this is where it can be challenging as a preacher, is how do you take that application for modern day? I made the point that for modern day Christians, Satan might not be successful in getting you to be utterly unfaithful in regards to idol worship, but he might be able to distract you so that you're not fully faithful.
Wholly faithful, yeah.
Right? And so that's how we talked about the alluring, the enticingness of the digital realm. That a lot of us, if we just tracked our time and our attention and our desires, most of them are flowing in the direction of digital engagement, not faithfulness to the Lord.
Yeah.
And so for us to be serious about the fact that the spirit of Babylon and the beast and the dragon still work today would be to take seriously the way that the dragon, the beast, the false harlot are embodied in the alluring, enticing nature of digital engagement. So that's when I held up this book that's been really impactful to me, Digital Liturgies. We've been going through it, and we've talked so far, Chris, about just the nature of wisdom and how we align ourselves with the reality God has given us. How technology tends to disembody us and remove us from place and location and presence with people. How we have to recapture those things and see the goodness of God's boundaries. The next episode we talked about just how technology as a whole, and using it very, very broadly, technology could be a hammer or a furnace or a train, and could be a phone, but it could be all those things, and how those things change us. The analogy given was of central heating. How does the ability to be comfortable in every room of the house change our dispersion?
Move us from the fireplace.
Right?
Yeah.
And then now we're zeroing in on the smartphone, maybe by proxy the personal laptop, as technologies, particularly because of how they give us intellectual content. So Samuel James presents this idea of the difference between physical technologies and intellectual technologies. So the hammer might change how you build something, whereas the web page changes how you think. And how you think determines how you communicate. So we're just talking about different spheres here. One of them would be how I complete my work. The other, how I think, how I talk, how I communicate. Any reflections first on that distinction between technologies?
Yeah, I mean, just introducing the idea of central heating and a hammer and stuff in earlier podcast was, I think, probably a little bit unexpected in some ways because we don't typically think of it as technology, right? And so I think it is a broader definition that was used at first. So what we're getting at now is probably what we normally think about as technology. And I think it helps us to narrow down this definition for our purposes today, because what we really want to get to here in the heart of this book, moving towards the idea of how is this shaping how we think, how we process reality. So, I think it's helpful for us to kind of narrow that down, because perhaps somebody would have been listening and said, like, well, I don't think, it's a stretch, the moving people in different rooms of the house. Well, we're not stretching anymore. We're narrowed here and we're focused, and I think this would be helpful for us to really kind of zero in on what's going on right now.
Well, I think it's a stretch, Chris, because we didn't see the change.
Correct.
I don't.
Yeah.
Even it was funny when I moved up here. I went to use my thermostat. I moved up here late May, so it was kind of cool-ish. And then maybe late June it gets pretty hot, and I go, well, I should get some heat or some airflow.
Yeah.
So I rented a pretty cheap apartment because I wasn't making any money at the news station, and so I go to crank up the AC. It doesn't work. Well, after a day or two of this, I call the maintenance guy, and he laughs at me. It was like, welcome to Wisconsin, dude. Cheap apartments don't have central air.
Oh, you thought there was central air in it?
Yeah. I'm from Tennessee. The idea that you don't have central air.
Apartments just have window units, man. Yeah.
So now, but I experienced a change there.
Yeah.
For most of us, we haven't experienced some sort of like, up until 15, I had only a hearth in the home.
Sure.
And then central air. And because we didn't experience a big change, we don't see it as a change. We just see it as it's always been. And I think we're starting to get that way with the smartphone. It's starting to get to a place where we can't imagine what it was like before the smartphone.
Right. Well, I think that's something where just our generation, which you're in my generation,
That was a high five.
what's unique, and I think what differentiates us from what we would call Gen Zers now, apart from just some years, is that you and I have memories of life before smartphones, right? Like, we have memories of what life was like before somebody could haul around an iPhone. You know, we both grew up in times where, you know, you had the cordless phone at home, right? Like, you made phone calls and you would like have to stay a certain distance from the base station on the phone, otherwise you'd cut the call out or something like that.
People's numbers memorized.
Right, exactly.
Still
People's
know Adam Smith's number.
speed dial. Oh yeah, there you go. There you go. And so that's what would happen. And now, you know, for people growing up, like our kids, as they're growing up now, they have no idea whatsoever what life is like apart from immediate access to digital information.
So what about you though, personally, Chris? Having grown up with some of the time period, do you vividly remember that, or is it becoming? For me, it's becoming increasingly hard to remember what it was like to not have Spotify on my phone.
Yeah,
I can think back to having to have a CD for my
Sure.
Isuzu Rodeo, but it's been so
Susie Rodeo.
it's been so long that Spotify has been my dominant. Like the idea of listening to commercials on the radio, it's almost, it feels like a different world to me. So yeah, I grew up and probably was in college before I had a smartphone, but I mean, it's been 13 years since I've been in college. It's a long time of habit formation.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, my memory is just interesting because of how my brain works, and I tend to remember things pretty vividly altogether. But, you know, I even look back at, I may have mentioned this previous podcast, but ICQ was this first, or AOL Instant Messenger. Like, those are some of the first things that showed up on computers where, you know, like friends in high school and junior high, like we'd go on and we would use that. Like, that was the way that we would get in touch with people and everything. And the thing is, you'd have to go to your living room or wherever the computer was, you know, and you'd log on and you'd see the messages waiting for you, right? Yeah. So I can remember that, but even that itself is a shift from where people would have to, you know, this whole business of, we had talked about this earlier before we started recording, this, you know, I guess where you can communicate now with people without immediately receiving a response. Like, you toss a message out there and you could receive an immediate response, but like, you don't have to now, right? So even that, for me growing up in junior high and high school, that was something that people used to communicate. But by and large, it was a phone call, right? Like, you call somebody on the phone, like, hey, you want to come over, you want to hang out, whatever. Like, that's what you would do to ensure a response. As far as
just to poke in the difference there. So let's say the difference between a letter, an email, a phone call, and a text. With a phone call, you're expecting either zero response or immediate response.
Correct.
Right?
Yep.
With an email, generally speaking, you're expecting a delayed response.
Yes.
Maybe you're sending it today and you feel no pressure to get to it till tomorrow or next week. With a letter, you're expecting a very delayed response.
If one at all.
If one at all. With a text, it's somewhere in between. It could be immediate, it could be delayed. Yeah. And you don't know why it's immediate.
See, there's anxiety over it, though.
Yes.
And that's the interesting thing.
Did Chris not respond because he saw it
exactly.
and didn't want to? Did he not respond because it was his birthday and he had other things he was doing?
Yeah.
Right. But on my end, I have no clue.
Exactly.
And that's where some of this, sure, the communication can be immediate, but since it's not always immediate, there's a disruption and a discombobulation in my expectations.
Yeah, and you know, so as far as my memories are concerned, it's been, I think, 10 years now since I've had a smartphone, you know, in my possession regularly. I think going back to 11 years. I think 2013 is the first time, like, I put off getting one. I remember my friends got iPhones in 2012. I thought it was like the coolest thing in the world. But I'm like, no, can't afford it, because at the time I was just like fresh out of seminary, didn't have like a full-time career job or anything. And so I'm like, okay, I'm not I'm not going there. Like I'm not making the investment in that kind of a thing. But yeah, I mean, as I think about even things like email, I'm just thinking, I expect my email now, right? And it's strange for me to think about that there's a time when I would have to log in and check my email. Like that's a very strange thought to me.
Yeah.
It's a very strange thought, and so it's not that I don't remember it. It's that it's hard for me to remember how I functioned that way.
Yeah.
So.
And that's a really good way to put it. It's not some sort of my brain has been lobotomized and I can't figure it out anymore. But it feels foreign, and that's kind of the point. So James talks about, and I always feel like I'm.
Or let me toss in one other word, not just foreign, but dysfunctional. That would be something that I would toss in as far as I think, like, you know, like how did, I mean, this is kind of gross. How do people live without toilet paper? Mm-hmm. Like how did that ever happen? Yeah. And for me, I'm thinking, like, how did it ever happen that I didn't have immediate access to my email? Like I just expect it all the time. It's going to come through, and it's strange to me if it doesn't come through immediately. Yeah. But like.
So that's good, Chris, because we can have this. All right, Chris and Josh, Sam and James, various people are talking about the problems of smartphones. You know, Jonathan Haidt just wrote this book that I'm picking up called The Anxious Generation, which tracks the rise in teen mental health problems since 2012. And we
very
hear,
general topic.
Yeah, we hear problems, and it's easier for us to go, but why would we do anything else? I mean, this thing is amazing. It's in my pocket. It provides so much for me.
Right.
How would I live without it? Why would I? And so part of the uncovering of this stuff is to give us motivation to rethink whether or not the thing that has been assumed in our lives is the best thing.
Right.
Right? Or at the very least, the thing that has been assumed unchained, untethered, without boundaries.
Right.
Maybe it needs boundaries because I'm not as strong as I thought I was, and I've become a different type of person.
Yeah, or maybe there's intent on the other end of it that we're not taking seriously.
Like the media networks and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, well, you just mentioned the statistic about, Google, about how they had, done some kind of study indicating that the stress levels involved with the whole process of notifications and everything was significantly higher. And then I made a snarky remark. It's like, and so they started investing more into it.
Yeah. So that's from Felicia Wusong has a book called Restless Devices. If you're looking for any further reading, Restless Devices, she has a chapter about, if you remember the movie The Social Network came out, and it was about people kind of whistleblowing from
JT was in
Silicon Valley. Yeah. No, sorry. Was it the same name? There's a movie, and then there's a documentary. I'm not talking about the...
Oh, yeah. Okay, gotcha.
I'm talking about the documentary where...
Social Dilemma. The Social Dilemma, yeah.
See, that's how... Man, even Facebook got me to reference the movie. So the Social Dilemma comes out, and it's mostly defectors and detractors from Silicon Valley. And so she kind of picks up on that in chapter 2 or 3 of the book.
And it's great, by the way. If you haven't seen it yet, please see it.
It'll scare your pants off, too. And she just talks about different people saying, hey, we knew what the stuff was doing, and we weaponized it.
Yeah.
And so that's another part of this. Now, where James comes in with chapter 3 is he talks a lot about habits and our brain's ability to change and be changed. Mm-hmm. And one example of that we've already said, Chris, is I can't think of living a different way, even though we know we did.
Right. And
so what has happened is our brains have been changed and adapted to expect a certain level of attachment, connection, availability on our phones. So he introduces the concept of neuroplasticity. There's a lot of fancy jargon.
Brain plastic.
Yeah, it's on. Yeah. But it basically means this: the human brain. This is on page 52 of his book. The human brain possesses within itself the capacity to change. The neural phenomena that are associated with one set of attitudes or behaviors can change into a different kind in response to repeated practices or consumption. In other words, our choices matter in shaping us into a certain kind of person. Think about a classic example of a kid in grade school who says, I can't pass the test, I'm stupid. You think, well, why do you think that? Well, because people have called me stupid. And they've called me stupid repeatedly. Yeah. And I now believe my brain, I've been changed into a pathway of thinking. Yep. And well, how do you undo that? You need someone to tell you that's not true. You need someone to repeatedly, not just one time. And so there's this idea of neuroplasticity that our brains can change and adapt, but it takes repeated practices. Now, think about what the most repeated practice in most of our days are. Okay, I shower every other day probably.
If that.
I eat 3 times a day. Well, 5, 6 times a day, including snacks.
Yeah.
I go to work, pick up my phone 72 times a day.
Oh.
What's my most repeated practice? And so what James is highlighting is our brains possess this capacity to change, but they change in relation to repeated practices. And what's the most repeated practice in most of our lives? Engagement with the digital media.
So you might say that just like a substance could create an addiction, that perhaps our habits can create addictions as well.
Yeah, they create certain expectations, at least. If you think of addiction as the expectation of a certain stimuli, right? So I have a craving for said drug or stimulant because I expect to feel a different way.
Right.
Even exercise can get that way.
Yep.
You know, if you work out 5 days a week, 6 days a week, on your off day,
You feel awful.
Yeah, you're a little like, what am I doing?
Yep.
And there's an expectation for a certain feeling. Felicia Wusong in her book, she notes this in that same paragraph about restlessness and Google. She says, kind of here's how our life works. Because of our engagement with digital technology so frequently, we have become restless because we're constantly disrupted, constantly thinking about a new thing, constantly going, constantly stimulated.
Yeah.
Which means when we actually have time to rest, we find ourselves to be unsettled. And we're unsettled thinking, well, I don't want to just sit here. And so we think the way to fix that unsettling is to reach for our phones. But then what typically happens is we find something that raises our adrenaline or our cortisol levels and makes us frustrated,
100%
or angry,
guilty. Yep.
or heightened. And so we're still restless, but we thought the restlessness would be fixed by the fix.
Yep.
So I think that's where it would maybe coincide with the idea of an addiction is an addictive mentality. I want to get out of this uncomfortable feeling, and this will fix it, but it doesn't fix it.
I mean, just think about what gambling does. I mean, or even drug use. I mean, I've never participated really in either. I mean, I've gotten some scratch-off tickets and gone to a casino once in my life. But, I think somebody shows up and they have this inner sense of like, man, I need to get some money. Like that's how a lot of people do. It's like, I need to get some money. Or, they might say that it's the sense of, pleasure they get from winning. It's like, no, you want money, right? Like that's why you go gambling. You don't go gambling because you want hamburgers. You want money. And so he's like, okay, I'm just going to do this. And you go there and there might be a temporary sense of satisfaction that you get from it. But you're like, but man, I lost this much already. And I came wanting more, and so you just keep on doing this and you keep on doing this. And the thing is that I would suggest, again, Social Dilemma is super helpful because it helps understand what's actually going on, right? Like, how are these companies, and they're not these benevolent overlords. Like they're really not. Like these are not benevolent overlords. They're designing their products to do a certain thing.
Yeah.
And so just like drugs, just like gambling, the house always wins.
And the thing is not to satisfy you. So that's another.
Exactly.
This podcast today is turning into a podcast on Felicia Wusong's book, but she mentions in that chapter people admitting that they were not seeking to satisfy people; they were seeking to entice people.
Yeah.
So thinking back to this
100%.
Babylon. So she talks about Candy Crush as a game. Now this is not social media,
man.
but Candy Crush was never meant to be the same kind of thing as eating a really rich meal.
Right.
Where you eat a really rich meal, you should end the meal and say, I've had enough and I don't need more. That was really good.
After I had hernia surgery, what was it, a year and a half ago, whatever, I sat there on a tablet and just played Candy Crush because I'm like, oh, I'm sitting here.
And it's just meant for like these minor feedback loops.
Yep.
That just enough to keep you engaged. But the goal is to keep you engaged because there's ads in between levels and those types of things. So it's just enough to keep you engaged, never enough to satisfy you.
Then a half hour later, you come back because you get your life renewed, right?
Yes. And so she uses that as an image of what most social media companies do. And then, by extension, it's something like Netflix where the shows roll over without, you have 7 seconds to say no in between. Because, I can do that. I can say no in 7 seconds.
Right.
But it's just enough to keep you, just enough to keep you. And what I think the idea of neuroplasticity would talk about is that if you do that enough, you become the type of person who is passively engaged to minor stimulants.
Sure. Yep.
Right? And James, you mentioned gambling. James actually talks about gambling as how if you've been in a casino and you kind of look at the person on the slot machine, it's almost a zombie-like
Checked
look.
out. Oh,
They're
absolutely.
not elated.
Yep.
You know, it's not like, what a ride. You know,
Yep.
this is amazing. It's zoned out,
Yep.
flick. And if you look at any of our faces when we're on our phones half the time, it's the same thing.
Yep.
And we only really catch the reality of that when we see it on someone else's face.
Oh, totally. I mean, so several years ago, Rosalie and I went, Simeon was just a little baby at the time, for a job that I had, and their headquarters out in Las Vegas. And I'd never been there before and never intend to go back. And the place was located, it was downtown Vegas, right? So it wasn't the Strip, it was downtown Vegas. It was like old Las Vegas. And so kind of the historic casinos and stuff like that are down there. And the company that I worked for put us up in a casino hotel because that's what's there, right? It's casino hotels. And last time I'd been in a casino, I think, was back in 1994, something like that, or maybe 92, where our family took a trip out to South Dakota. And we just, like, my parents don't gamble, they don't drink, but we just, like, went to this casino because
But they're still really fun.
Right, yeah, they are. That's true. That's true. But it was out in Deadwood, South Dakota, and we went out there. And it's like, okay, well, this old west town, they have these casinos there, and so went out to it, and I terrible experience there. There's cigar smoke, and I just felt sick to my stomach. Had never been back, and so went to Vegas then, and we walked through the lobby, and you talk about like passive stimulant consumption. Like what we saw people sitting at slot machines with cigarettes. And you know what's interesting is you think about cigarettes, and cigarettes are the same type of thing, right? It's like this passive stimulation. And if you're a smoker and you're smoking, like you think, okay, well, yeah, you know, addiction, I'm in control, but like what's happening? Like you hold this thing in your hand and it's controlling you, but you're getting these little puffs, these little drags where it's like, oh yeah, this makes me feel good. This makes me feel good. And you don't want to go off of it because these good feelings that you're getting, temporary highs that you get from this, is going to keep reinforcing it. And so, yeah, you're just seeing people at these slots and they're smoking cigarettes and they're just pulling the lever nonstop. Yeah. It's like, man, this is so awful. It's just so wrong. But to the point about phones, I mean, you know, we had a little dose of it this weekend. There was the big trivia thing in Point. And it was interesting because you had to be on your computers to do the searching for the clues, to get the answers and everything. And so I'm not faulting anybody because I'm sitting there doing it just the same. But it's interesting. I looked around the room and I'm like, as these questions get asked, everybody is just on their phone or on their computer doing this digging. I'm thinking, man, in real life, apart from trivia like this is how people function. Yeah. It's just sitting there staring, scrolling, searching, acknowledging other people, but not actually engaging others. Yeah,
maybe it was the last chapter. At some point in James's book, he says that we have become the type of people that, and maybe it's this chapter too, but we've become the type of people where the internet fills the gaps in our thinking. That could be boredom gaps. I don't know what to think. The internet fills it. Yeah. It could be intellectual gaps. I don't know how to think about this. The internet fills it. Yeah. And we'll get to that in a little bit. That the more and more we rely on technology to think for us, the more and more we have to have it to think for us. Right. Because we can't think on our own. Yeah. And so, you know, when you talk about just being around another person, how many times when you're just with another person is there this, I don't know what we're going to talk about next.
A lull, right?
And you could fill every one of those lulls now with a phone.
Yep.
And that's actually safer.
Yep.
Because I kind of know what I'm going to get from Wes Rucker on 24/7 Sports or from Josh Dawes. I'm going to get political conservatism from Josh Dawes. I'm going to get sports from here. I'm going to, I'm going to get this from over here. And I know what I'm going to get. But if I'm just like waiting for Chris to talk about what if Chris says, hey man, I got a problem. And then I got to go, what if I don't have the solution? You know, there's Wu Song says there's a sacred unpredictability to people. And we want to control and have predictability. Sure. So we go to our phones rather than that sacred unpredictability. Yeah. Let's talk for a second about habits, Chris, because if our brains are plastic, they're changeable, and they are changed by repeated practices or habits, we don't really live in a world that thinks in terms of habits and disciplines. Discipline is not a sexy word in modern American culture. No. We pursue quick pleasures. If it feels good, do it. Those types of things. And reflect on the necessity of habits in the Christian life to form us. Yeah. We don't just become Christians flash in a pan or
Yeah.
by big emotional moments.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a pretty well attested thing that I mean we're finishing Revelation, and what's a theme that's been repeated multiple times, whether it's in the letters to the seven churches or whether it's in the visions themselves. But the statement that constantly recurs is to those who overcome, to those who overcome, to those who overcome, and the picture of the individual in I think all the New Testaments alike. You think about the apostate in Israel and Judah. Think about the apostate in the New Testament church. Those individuals are the ones who just flake out, right? They're people who've said, "Yeah, not worth it," and so they're not looking at the end game. They're not looking at a permanent, situation. They're looking at temporary pleasures. And what does the psalmist in Psalm 73 say? He's like, you know what? I grew pretty frustrated when I looked at the prosperity of the wicked.
Yeah.
Pretty frustrated because I thought, all in vain have I kept my heart clean. All in vain have I washed my hands in innocence. But then he says this. He says, this is how I thought until I went into the temple of God and I really thought about it. When I really thought about it in the presence of the Lord and considering the long-term realities of this world, I came to this conclusion that even though it seems like the wicked are having a good time, even though it seems like living for the here and now without disciplines of godliness it's a preferable, pleasurable thing to do that. I mean, he says the Lord sets them in slippery places, and that their end will come quickly, right? I mean, it's not in the vast scope of eternity. These types of what we look at as temporary pleasures or temporary disciplines lead to a result, right? Like there's a long-term result, there's long-term consequences for present temporary decisions and disciplines and pleasures. And so I think throughout the Christian life, what we're presented with is the constant call, and I think this is something that I reflect on when I think about self-control, right? Fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, like it all sounds like great things, and then self-control. And it adds on the end there that thing is like, well, how is that a fruit of the Spirit? It seems like, a Spirit-filled person is loving and joyful. It's like, yeah, that's true. And a Spirit-filled person is also self-controlled. And so as you think, like, what are the dynamics of the Christian life? The dynamics of the Christian life are dynamics that involve a certain type of discipline that says, I am going to save my affections for the things that matter most. And I am going to make sure that in the moments where my affections are being appealed to, in order to throw them away effectively in God's economy, to throw them away on lesser things, I have to be disciplined. Disciplined, godly, upright lives. I mean, this is just like over and over and over again. You hear these instructions like discipline matters, not
Paul
because
says he beat his body.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not because Christian, living is sadomasochistic. It's not like we derive pleasure in self-discipline. We don't, and I don't think that there's any type of biblical warrant to say like, the denial of the flesh in some kind of like Neoplatonistic way is somehow what's going on here. That's not the issue. The issue is that we need to take seriously the fact that our hearts are drawn toward things that are not only temporary pleasures, but they're damaging to us, right?
Well, the difference between a human and a beast, right? And I think in Ecclesiastes, people who only think under the sun, and by Ecclesiastes terminology, that means they're not thinking about the Lord who's over the sun, who's created all things and has given them as gifts. They act in a beastly manner.
Right.
It's kind of an old English way to talk about you're being brutish, you're being beastly. And when you look at a dog that acts beastly, they eat their poop, they run away, they do disgusting things. And we have these cute little animals in our house, but every once in a while your dog reminds you that they're a beast.
Correct.
Well, what's the difference between a beast and an image bearer? Well, when properly constituted, an image bearer reflects on what they're going to do before they do it.
Right.
And so it's not just denial of pleasure, it's a processing of what is a good pleasure or a bad pleasure, right? God is not anti-pleasure. In that same book in Ecclesiastes, he says, anyone who God has given wealth and possessions and the power to enjoy them. Because you will not much remember the days of your life, God will keep you occupied with joy. So enjoy your wealth, enjoy your possessions, enjoy your family, enjoy your work. God has given you the power. God is not anti-joy. What he is anti unprocessed pleasure pursuit like an animal.
Well, and it's
And-
dehumanizing because, you think about why is it sad for us to go into a casino and see all kinds of people over the age of 60 throwing Social Security checks into these slot machines. It's because it's dehumanizing. It's not just sad because we look at them and say like, oh, they could be doing something more fun. I'm not thinking like they could be having more fun at a water park. I'm not thinking that. I'm thinking this is dehumanizing.
Yeah.
This is nothing reflected here of the image of God in these people. What they're doing is just they're throwing their hearts away. And it's a dehumanizing experience. And I think that's our fear with the way that the digital revolution has taken place is it's pulling hearts and dehumanizing people.
So maybe a way to say this in the fallen world, in the modern world, is to be a Christian is to practice seeking greater joys over lesser pleasures.
Sure.
And that does take practice. So for instance, if you're in a room, let's say you're watching the Packers play in the divisional round, right? And you're in a room with multiple people. During commercial breaks, the easier pleasure is phone. And it may not even in isolation be a bad pleasure.
Sure.
Maybe you're checking what a writer that you follow has said. Maybe you're checking if other people on Facebook are watching it, yada, yada, yada.
If a coach has gotten fired yet.
The easier pleasure is phone, but the greater pleasure is the people that you're in the room with.
Right.
And you actually have to practice the denial of the lesser pleasure to pursue the greater pleasure.
Right.
And another example, I believe the Puritans would, and the Puritans are talked about as like killjoys, but they weren't. They were, generally people who had great pleasure in God,
right.
primarily, over and above this world. And you think about a time where diseases are rampant and infant mortality is pretty high. Like, you're gonna want to have your pleasure in God because you
right.
don't know how much longer you live.
Yep.
And the Puritans, I believe, would distinguish between passions and affections.
Sure.
And so passions are the types of things that come upon you like a wave, and affections are the type of things that are kindled.
Right.
Kindled like a fire. So you think about the difference between a blowtorch and a fire. A blowtorch, passion. Push a button, fire, hot, immediate. Burns you quickly.
Yep.
But a fire, you have to build the kindling, you have to light it slowly, you have to kind of tenderly care for the bird's nest or the cedar bark. You have to slowly build from small to medium to mid-large to large wood. You have to build it, and then an hour later or so you start to build a bed of coals, and really 2 or 3 hours later
right.
you have this beautiful, rich, very hot.
And it ain't going out for a long time.
No, even if you pour water on it,
Yep.
it's still really hot because
Yep.
you've built the bed of coals. And
Yep.
and that's an example of the difference between pleasure pursuit, passions, and habituating, building practices of affections. It's the difference, Chris. When I think about this, I think about the difference between Taco Bell and a steak salad. So if I'm driving down Grand Avenue in Wausau and I see Taco Bell, there's a part of me that's like passion. Just like it comes, it's like all of a sudden I've been counting calories for 4 weeks and I don't care.
Nachos Bel Grande.
Yeah, give me a Crunchwrap Supreme now and fast, and I'm going to eat it like a beast.
Gross.
It's going to be animalistic. Hopefully no one else is in the car.
Yeah.
Versus one of my wife and I's favorite meal is a steak, sweet potato, avocado salad. There's richness there, right? It's not anti-pleasure.
Sure.
avocados are rich. They're a rich fat.
Yeah.
Sweet potatoes, you can season them with cumin and make them really lovely. And you get steak. It's hearty. It's cooked right. For you, right is burnt to a crisp. For me, right
well done.
is medium rare. But you look at that salad, and I can eat a ton of it. Just an enormous portion, and I can feel fantastic afterwards.
As opposed to one gordita at Taco Bell, and then you're out.
And so that's the real world example to me between passions and affections.
Exactly.
Now, guess what? I had to build the affection for that salad.
Right.
I had to eat it a few times to know what I feel like afterwards.
Sure.
I had to savor it enough times to know the richness of something that maybe it's not rich like ice cream's rich,
right.
but it's rich.
Yep.
And I think that's where the Christian comes in, and we have to make sure we're habituating ourselves, practicing, pursuing rich things in this world rather than fleeting pleasures.
And the thing is, and to be clear, like fleeting pleasures, so long as they're not sinful, like inherently sinful, right? Like a fleeting pleasure in terms of, using the eating analogy, like it's not wrong to stop at Taco Bell. It might be medically wrong to stop at Taco Bell, but it's not morally wrong. And so, there are lesser pleasures God has given us to enjoy, right? Like he's created all things, to be received, and used by his people for good. Like as long as they're not inherently sinful. The problem is where these lesser pleasures start eclipsing the greater pleasures, and when the habits of easy things start to push out the habits for greater things. And like you said, having a phone in a room, friends watching a football game, like, well, it's not wrong to check your phone.
Nope.
But it is wrong to sit there and stare at it to the neglect of something greater.
Yeah. Yeah, so the pursuit of a pleasure that passes away is fine, because we've been preaching through Revelation, everything in this world's passing away.
Right.
The key is my habitual use of technology changing me to a type of person who constantly pursues those pleasures at the expense of greater pleasures.
Yep.
And when it comes to individual personal connection, am I constantly pursuing digital connection over real life person-to-person presence?
Right.
Coming back to some of the concepts in Samuel James's book, I'm just going to read some extended quotes and ask for your reflections, Chris.
Yeah.
He says, human attention is finite. That means limited. Human attention is finite. There are limits to how well and accurately we can think when our attention is besieged with multiple stressors. The problem is that the internet's unique conscience-bending format trains our minds not to sit and reflect, but to keep scrolling, to keep skimming, to keep looking for a novel bit of information. Nicholas Carr, one author, has described the internet as an interruption system, a machine geared for dividing attention. So the idea here, Chris, is, habits change us. So then how is the habit, and the internet is a technology that's a certain type of technology, it's an intellectual technology, it changes how we think. So if habits change us and the internet changes how we think, then habitual use of the internet changes us how? Well, the how here that James is talking about is it changes us to be disrupted, distracted, and divided.
Sure.
And if we've been changed long enough, we might not feel what it felt like to not be disrupted 15 years ago, to not be divided attention-wise, to not be distracted.
Yep.
What I would like your reflections on, Chris, is how those disrupted, divided, distracted are counter to Christian views of maybe meditation or reflection or pondering of the goodness of God. How does the things we're changed into keep us from being fully Christian?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a word that I would use that would probably be helpful, and I think in light of, so I just preached 1 through 5 in Revelation 22 yesterday, right? So the last vision that John has before the book gets wrapped up, and we hear the injunctions against tooling around with it and everything. And the interesting things you find, and I don't think I'm pressing the point too much here, but that when you get to the New Jerusalem and when you see this city and you see this new renewed Garden of Eden, what you see that's unique there is that the presence of the Lord is there, right? And so I want to use that word presence to kind of help us maybe understand what's going on here. And I think that something that is uniquely human is that we're created in God's image, not simply because we're rational beings or anything like that, but because we're created to have genuine relationship, right? Like God is genuinely relational because he's Trinitarian in nature. Right. So the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are infinitely and eternally present with each other. They're undivided in their affection for each other. And one of the horrors of the incarnation is the fact that the Son, when he is judged on behalf of his people, there is a break there in the Son's active relationship with the Father in terms of him standing as a substitute, being damned in the place of his people, right? Like that's the most horrific thing about the cross. If you really think about it, it's not being crucified. I mean, Jesus said, "Don't fear him who can kill your body. Fear him who can cast both body and soul into hell." So it's like, okay, there's something more startling about the cross, and what's startling about the cross is when, Christ cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? There's this feeling of brokenness in communion with the Father that has never been felt before because he's experiencing as a substitute. And so, that I don't think it's too high level to bring it down to just our regular everyday experiences, because God is inherently relational and he created us in his image to be relational. And so anything that detracts from the relationality of human beings is inherently dehumanizing. You think about feral children, and there are only a handful of documented experiences where this has occurred, but kids who get left out in the middle of nowhere, even things like radical attachment disorder, where children are left in orphanages at age 2 months, and they have nobody taking care of them because they're so overrun by children and not enough people to take care of them. They have massive problems as they get older. I mean, huge problems, because you're created to relate to other people, especially at such an early age. And if you can't, like, your ability to connect becomes so disoriented that you're fundamentally just messed up until somebody can help you work through that stuff. So I think, what's the disruption that this stuff causes, the disruptiveness of, and I don't want to just use the term broadly of internet, because I think just the accessibility of the internet, it preys on the human heart, right? Like, I don't think that immediate access to information is inherently a bad thing. And so I think we need to be careful that we don't just like toss it in that camp. But I do think platforms, you look at social media platforms and, the social dilemma, again, referencing that, like, they're designed for a reason. The internet wasn't necessarily designed for any other reason than to have immediacy of communication, right? But, Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat, like, these are all designed for something. And there are people who are depending on their financial benefit for you to behave a certain way. And they have found that the human heart, if given to itself, is most easily exploited when given to its worst inclinations. And so the human heart's worst inclinations, like, what is sin? It's dehumanizing. So if sin can dehumanize your relational life, then it's going to do it. It's going to attack it. And so all that's really happening with social media platforms and everything is they're coming after the fallen human heart. And it's just like, Pornhub, right? Like, why does it make bajillions of dollars? It's because it's appealing to the worst inclinations of the human heart. And it's a dehumanizing thing, not only to those who are participating in it, performing, but to those who are consuming. It's dehumanizing, right? And so we're designed to have relationship, right? Whether it's sexual relationship, it's an actual relationship. It's not a disjointed thing. Communication with other people is supposed to be relational. It's not supposed to be disjointed. And these comments that get left on, message boards, Reddit, or whatever, it's just like, you don't even know the other person, and you're like telling people F off. I mean, like, literally just saying horrible things to people. It's like, is that how you're designed as a human being? No, you're not. What that's reflecting, though, is the ruin of sin and what sin has done to the human heart.
Yeah, there's a real cumulative, comprehensive effect of the world, the flesh, and the devil. Because you have the spirit of Babylon working through tech companies to tempt you and entice you.
Right.
You have the world that inhabits those companies of people on the Reddit channel or on Twitter or whatever that incite.
Yep.
But we're not innocent sufferers.
Right.
We have our own engagement with and our own vitriol, and so we can't take all of the blame, but we can't take none of the blame.
Right.
And so that's why the world, the flesh, and the devil is such a helpful dynamic. There is an enemy of our souls who is smarter than us. He's the ancient serpent, the dragon, the deceiver, who is Satan. There is the world around us of the totality of humanity wrapped up in sin. And then there's our own heart where we oftentimes feel what the Apostle Paul felt in Romans 7. I know what I ought to do, and yet I don't do it. And the thing that I don't want to do, I do.
Right.
And so when we can see, I think maybe one of the things I've reflected on, particularly because I've been the guy, I think I've read now 5 books in the last year on tech stuff, and I still have problems with my engagement with,
Sure.
And I have sensed my own profound weakness. The anger that I mean, sitting in my own home when my wife challenges why I'm on, and not even challenges in like a snide way, but just says, kind of the thing we'll do in the house is say, well, what are you doing? Or anything worth it? Just kind of playfully say, is there anything on there that's worth more than the people in front of you?
Yep.
And I get mad when she asks that.
Yeah.
I was like, who are you to ask me if what? Because of course no.
I mean, you're just my wife.
But so my own profound weakness in inability to, without restraints of I'm not going to touch it here or here, to just go towards it.
Right.
It shows me my own fleshly weakness.
Yeah.
And where that's important is because we want to keep thinking, am I the type of person that God wants me to be? Not just the type of person I want to be, because maybe we are. Maybe we're like fine with ourselves.
Sure.
Am I the type of person God wants me to be, or that God has made me to be? And when we come to the idea of disruption, distraction, and division, I know in my own life that because, and it's, it could be books as well, but probably it's the fact that I can order any book in 2 days. That's really the problem.
One day in Stephen's Point.
It's not, it's not just that there's more books than ever before. It's that I can get them in 2 days.
Yeah.
You know what that makes me do, Chris? there's always something I could be reading.
Right.
Internet articles, whether it's things I disagree with or things that I want to learn from. I mean, there's just massive amounts of publications. There's always something to read.
Yeah.
There's always something new on Twitter. There's always, I could be learning Hebrew. I could be learning Greek. I could be texting so-and-so. I could be responding to so-and-so. I could be doing this. I could be doing that, which makes it really hard for me to just be a dad.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or just be a friend. And that's where I think the relationality that you're talking about, that beautiful, undivided relationality within the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that God welcomes us into.
Right.
Right? That then he says in 1 John, the fellowship that we take part of together, and the fellowship that then we extend to the brothers, that brotherly but both the fellowship we have with God and the fellowship we have with brothers has been divided, distracted, disrupted.
Sure.
Because we can't sit for very long and think about any one thing or be with any one person.
Yep.
Because our phones are constantly screaming, you could be elsewhere with someone else doing something else. And so I think we should just reckon with the fact that when we look at our friends, when we look at our churches, when we look at our relationship with the Lord, when we look at our fruitfulness to non-believers.
Yeah.
I mean, how often would we ever pray for a non-believer? We don't have any breaks in our day. And so are we the type of people that God wants us to be, with unified vision on him and his church and the brothers and sisters we have? And this kind of brings to the last point, is that James says our minds, or he says something, then I wrote down, our minds are also brains. It's like, whoa, how insightful.
Well, that's been all for a time to think.
So what James connects is to say, God has made us body and soul. And maybe we would even say soul is primary. We're going to get a new body. You know, you could have a discussion.
Well,
is it
yeah,
primary,
I don't
secondary?
think...
What we can't say is that there's no connection.
Right.
And that tends to be where modern thought goes, is there's really no... You can sleep with whoever you want, Chris. It's not going to affect your mind.
You know,
It's just your body.
that's funny. It's Gnosticism.
Yes.
First century Gnosticism.
Right. And so it's this common thing that crops back up, but that's really, do whatever you want with your body because it doesn't affect you.
Yep.
Well, the truth is it does. It
Yep.
affects you profoundly. And the same is true with your eyes. Just stay on social media as long as you want. It won't affect you except for when you can't sleep.
Right.
And then if you can't sleep, what happens to your spirit and your soul? You get angry more often.
Yeah.
You know, like, so James is trying to say all of this drives us to the fact that our minds are parts of our bodies that are connected to our souls. And so what we train our minds to do is going to affect our souls.
Yeah.
And thus, if we train our minds to this, he says the restlessness that many modern people feel when they are unplugged for a while is a restlessness that is built into many of our machines. As our brains become accustomed to non-stop input, surface level engagement, and hurried scrolling from one bullet point to the next, the reality of neuroplasticity begins. What's more, the internet's most important and intrinsic features, such as search engines and algorithms, begin to think for us. As our attention span thins and our capacity for quality reflection diminishes, we begin to depend more and more and more on the web's tools of efficiency and attention grabbing. We begin to think like the internet.
Welcome, ChatGPT.
What do you mean?
What is it doing for people now? It's thinking for them, literally.
Yeah.
You go to ChatGPT and you say, hey, I need you to do this for me. It's like, okay, sounds good. Well, there we go. You know, we've engineered ourselves out of existence in some ways. We've completely dehumanized ourselves now.
Yeah, it's a really expanded form of who was that in that movie? And instead of stopping to think about it, or with a friend trying to
Right.
like, oh, can we figure this out?
Right.
Can we figure out who this was in that movie? We'll just Google it.
Yep.
And well, that is going to, over the course of time, lower our retention, right? Because we're not practicing memory; we're
Yep.
practicing quick engagement.
Yep.
Now, how does that reflect? I mean, how does that change us as Christians? I mean, did you have any? I did personally. Did you have any problem meditating on all things new as you're trying to bring that reality?
Oh,
to other
totally.
people?
Totally. I mean, I acknowledged it yesterday when I said, you know, I was listening to Alistair Begg and was listening to him preach on the passage, and he used the word earthbound, and that the church is too earthbound. And I'm like, yep, 100%. I don't think about eternity. And I mean, I think about eternity in an abstract way, like, you know, live for eternity, right? I'm just kind of the trite Christian phrases we'll toss out there. But, you know, do I really think upon the fact that there will be a day where the things that are now problematic are gone? Do I really think about the fact that we're going to go home? Like, really, go home?
Mm-hmm.
I don't, and it's funny because I'm preaching about that yesterday. Like, I started feeling a little bit choked up inside. And I'm like, Chris, you're preaching for like 45, 50 minutes right now. Like, why don't you just do this another time during the week? And, and so I think what it reflects for all of us, whether it's our people or us, like, we're given throughout the week to thinking about so many immediate things that we don't stop to think, what would be the impact of taking, not that the immediate things don't matter, but what would be the impact of conditioning our relationship to immediate things by considering things that require us to actually just, like, okay, going home one day. How does that stop me from worrying right now?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just, it's one of the things I love about some of the older people in our church, and
not just the people that look old.
Right.
Like,
yeah, exactly. Right.
Old? Okay.
The older people. And, there's a woman named Jean, and Jean's been with us in Stevens Point from the very beginning. And Jean constantly has pearls of wisdom to share that reflect somebody who isn't caught up with immediate things. I just love it.
Yeah.
I love it. So.
Yeah, there's a dear sister in our church. It's funny, we were at prayer this past week, and she prayed. She's, probably in her 60s. She prayed for the sweet younger people in our church. And I just said, can I thank God for the sweet old people?
The sweet old people.
And we had a fun moment because one of the things I've tried to instill, particularly in the older generation in our church, is their great value.
Yeah.
Because, we're just reading Proverbs, and I've got me and another millennial, and then two guys retirement age, and we're just talking about the Proverbs being written from a father to a son perspective, and the father saying, watch out for these things.
Yeah.
And the reality is, hey, I've lived more life than you. I've gone down some of these roads. I know what the end of these things is. Watch out. Don't do this. And so I just asked these guys, if you ever see those things in us, tell us, because there are roads I haven't been down.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the benefit of older wisdom. And this dear sister, she claps every time there's a moment of resurrection in any song. It's great. I will be listening to a song and I'll think, that's the moment Janet claps. Because, and I asked her about it, and she goes, it's just more real to me. I just know how real it is. Well, what's the difference between a 13-year-old who gets baptized, or a 21-year-old gets saved in college, or a 30-year-old who's been a pastor for a little while, and their knowledge of the resurrection versus someone who's been with the Lord and needed the power of the resurrection for 40 years, 50 years?
Yep.
It's just go back to that idea of biblical knowledge. It's a deep thing. It's an intimate thing. And so many of the well springs of life in, the river or the water of life that comes out of the throne of God, so many of those things necessitate reflection. It's something as simple as, what does it mean that Chris and Josh are sons of God? Not employees, not hired hands.
Right.
Oh, it probably means I'm not getting thrown out of the family.
Right.
Well, what does that feel like? It requires sustained reflection. What does it mean that all things are new? That the former things pass away to such a degree that I won't remember.
Behold. Yeah.
Well, these types of things, they're not, as James talks about, they're not novel bits of information. They require years of thinking.
Yeah.
And if we actually don't we don't get our thirst quenched.
Yep.
That was kind of one of the points I made. I preached Revelation 21, 1 through 8 yesterday. And at the end of it, it says, to this heritage I give to my sons, essentially, that they will have their thirst quenched by the river of life.
Yeah.
And I just said, friends, are we allowing our thirsts to get satiated by lesser? I've come across a number of people that say they don't like water, and it baffles me. I just think that's such an American thing, because it's like, I can drink coffee, or I can drink beer, or I can drink Gatorade, or I can drink fizzy water, or I can drink anything but water.
Yeah.
But it's like, when you have exhausted yourself, you want water.
Yep.
And my question was, do we never actually let ourselves get spiritually exhausted so that we need water? We're constantly, I'll just drink coffee until noon, and then I'll pick it up with an energy drink, and
Right.
and I'm never actually getting thirsty, which means I never actually get the water. And the same is true in our spiritual life. It's like if I feel anxious, I'll distract over here. If I feel depressed, I'll get joy over here. I'll take minor pleasure over here.
Yep.
And I never get to the bottom of my thirst for the Lord, which
Yeah.
means I never get quenched. And I think let's be people that allow ourselves to get spiritually thirsty so that Christ can quench that thirst.
Yeah.
Right?
Amen.
So that's round 3 of Digital Liturgies. That kind of the first 3 episodes are foundational episodes, and the next kind of 5 chapters are about specific liturgies. Now, heads up, not every one of us is going to experience each liturgy in the same way, but you might know someone who does.
Sure.
And so kind of paying attention to each liturgy, how it changes how we think and how we act, how we love is going to be important, because this whole experiment has to be done in a community. I mean, you and I are learning just by talking to each other.
Right.
But the reality of even like limited phone usage is, I got to do something with my time and my attention. So I'll be with Chris. You know, it involves relational engagement. So we'll talk about those liturgies on the next round of A Time to Think. Until then, maybe, just maybe, this was worthy of pondering and reflection. And when the theme song cues, you could take 5 minutes or 10 minutes, write something down. Something about the Lord that's worthy of more reflection, something about this podcast or Samuel James's book that you just want to spend a little more time with. Just pause,
Take a
reflect.
time to think.
Your own time to think.